Afternoon. I recognize this is a news conference. It's probably going to be a little bit more conversational than news conference. The reason I called you here today is to provide an update regarding the homicide from July 2nd that occurred in Fountain Hills, where, as I'm sure many of you are aware, 92-year-old Anna Blessing was arrested for the murder of her son, 78-year-old Thomas Blessing.
Pull that out of there.
Do you need a minute?
Yeah.
Do you need a minute?
Okay. Sorry, we're having audio trouble.
I'm fine.
So again, the purpose of this is to provide you with an update, and I want to be very clear about the circumstances. When it relates to the details of the investigation, it is still a fluid investigation. Therefore, I'm not going to be discussing details that might undermine or conflict with what needs to remain confidential as we proceed through prosecution. As it relates to other aspects, I've always made the pledge and commitment to be transparent and forthright with everything that goes on in this office, good, bad, or indifferent. And first, I want to begin by saying I am always accountable to my own words. And that's one of the most important things that you can do in leadership. And when this story first broke, and I had some information regarding this and gave some statements relative to it, I talked about the fact that not all acts of violence or homicides are predictable or preventable, which is true. But as a law enforcement agency, we do have an obligation to ensure that we do a thorough review of all of our actions to determine if things could have been done to potentially mitigate any acts of violence or crime within our community. It does not mean that we're responsible for it. It does not mean that we always have the solutions. But should we have fallen short in any way, it is our responsibility to ensure that that does not occur, and if it has occurred, that we act accordingly. As it currently stands, Mrs. Blessing is in the custody of our jail. She is in the infirmary, not for any particular medical or mental health issues, but just because of her advanced age. We have continued to do a thorough review of all information that was either available at the time of this incident or preceding the incident. And details that I am aware of now that I was not then when I spoke was the fact that our agency had been to the home a few times prior. The reason that we were out were to investigate domestic disputes between the victim and her son and potential threats. The time of this incident, when our detectives, and this is post the homicide, searched the home, they recovered 13 weapons from the house. 11, which we understand were possessions of the victim, 2 of the suspect. None of these weapons were secured in any type of a safe or locked cabinet. It's my understanding that they were all in spaces that were open access. I bring that to your attention just to give clarity in some of the information, knowing that this environment of itself was one that had many firearms available. When I talked about our deputies responding historically, there were communications between the parties expressing the frustration in the relationship, even to the point where both had expressed a concern that the other party could become violent. We're continuing to review all of those audio and videotapes that we have, the body-worn cameras. And the purpose of this is to determine if our deputies acted accordingly. If they took any and all action they are lawfully empowered to do, to see if some action should have or could have been taken that might have mitigated this. I tell you this because it is always our responsibility to not only enforce the laws, but to try to support public safety to the best of our ability, with the hopes that you can avoid situations such as these. And when we avoid them often, we don't even realize that they could have occurred. But when they do, we look in rear view and make determinations. And then it is my job and responsibility to ensure that if we made mistakes, they never occur again, that people are held accountable for any shortcomings, or that training and education is delivered when appropriate. We are not at that stage yet, but I just want to speak about the stages, knowing that we had been out there previously.
How many contacts did they have?
We're not there yet. Let me finish, please. Additionally, I want to emphasize this factor. If we failed in any way, shape, or form, that is unacceptable. But we are not ultimately the ones responsible when an individual decides to take an act of using a firearm or other weapon to take another life. It is that individual's responsibility, and they own that act. We also know that because we live in a society where I don't have an escalation of violence too often, but weapons of all types readily accessible, that law enforcement has taken on new demands and expectations that are oftentimes unfair and unrealistic. We are not mental health professionals. We are not drug addiction recovery professionals. We are not counselors. We are not social workers. Yet the majority of our calls involve this type of education or experience to resolve challenges. We are empowered to act within the law, and if there is not a violation of the law, we are limited. And in respect for the Second Amendment, we cannot overreact to take firearms from an individual because of a concern that falls short of a legal or lawful basis. If we take firearms from someone who needs them to defend themselves and we put them in harm's way or jeopardy, and we are often criticized for overreacting, and when we fail to do so, in a case that could be similar to this, if that could have been an option, then we are criticized for underreacting. I'm not saying this to defend anyone in law enforcement. I'm just speaking to the reality that as a society, we need to do more to ensure there are other resources beyond law enforcement to address these issues so that we don't have these tragic outcomes. I'm well aware that one of the family members has some tapes they spoke to. It was actually, I believe, the daughter of the victim, where he expressed his concerns, and those are on tapes. To my knowledge, we didn't possess those prior to this call. I would like to hear those and see what is entailed as we do our full audit, which I have directed my executive chief to do a full audit of all the calls for service that preceded this homicide to determine any and all judgments and if they were appropriate. I'd like to have all that information available to ensure that we can do the best job possible, knowing that we cannot undo this tragedy. We will do this in every case. And this office in the last year has seen over 1,100 internal investigations that involve violations of or potential violations of policy or other areas of concern. That is an extremely high number for any agency. So we take it very serious. So before I get to your questions, I just want to conclude by saying it is a tragedy. Any loss of life due to an act of violence in domestic circumstances are often the most volatile. Access to firearms, unfortunately, makes these types of acts more easy to carry out, and oftentimes become the topic of discussion. It is my hope that as a society we do more to find ways to resolve these issues and provide help for those in need before it escalates to this level, and that law enforcement always does an exceptional job, yet is free to the burden of other responsibilities outside of law enforcement. We will stay in contact with you as we go through this process, as we review everything and make determinations. Anyone in this office will be held accountable for any shortcomings that may have occurred, if in fact they did occur. I'm sorry to see a loss of life in any circumstance, but I still go back to that same place I began before, which is that the person who is responsible for taking that life, that made the decision that led to the outcome, and that's unfortunate. With that, I'm happy to answer your questions. Sir?
How many times were MCSO officers called over the house?
I don't know the total volume. I've seen as many as I believe 4 or 5 calls, not all of which involved any direct conflict that I'm describing today, but the 1 or 2 previous to that were engagements with both the victim and or the suspect related to their disputes.
So the family tells me that the victim told deputies that his mother had made statements about wanting to kill him, but since she didn't direct those statements directly at him, was told that deputies could not arrest her for threatening to kill him. Can you kind of explain that? I don't know if you know.
No, I understand the question.
But if his mother did threaten to kill him, not even to his face, could deputies not have detained her or questioned her or anything like that?
So in a case where you have threats posed against another individual, Arizona revised statutes as it relates to this type of a crime, you have to not only have the threat, but then the opportunity potential to carry that threat out. So the determination will be, was he in immediate danger at that time or going forward, and what were the specifics of the threat? And that's why, again, we're going to review all this to make the determination if, in fact, our deputies did act accordingly and carry out their duties as they are required to do so, or if they fell short of that.
Is that accurate, though, that if somebody potentially threatens to kill another person but doesn't directly threaten that person, is that accurate that officers can't do anything? Not
necessarily. There are other factors that could actually either establish or diminish the threshold for violating the crime.
What was the nature of those previous contacts? I mean, was it a dispute about putting her in an assisted living home, or what was the nature of the
Well, at least one of the calls of nature was the fact that there was conflict where they had a relationship that had led, I want to be careful not to use my own words, but it was obvious that there were frustrations in the relationship, even to the point where the escalation was either just below or at the threshold of making indirect or direct threats. That was only in one case that I know of, in one call. And again, we're still in the review process, but it is whether or not that threat is viable enough to justify a crime.
And you guys learned about the weapons after the shooting, right? You guys didn't know about the weapons when you went to the house, right?
No. The discussion of them owning weapons took place prior to the incident itself, but we weren't aware of the volume of weapons in the home until the investigation.
And
Was
those
all
are
guns?
12 all guns?
I can get you the recap on what they're all firearms. I don't know if they're handguns or rifles, but I can get you that.
Was the son ever accused of being violent towards his mother?
I don't have specifics relative to any type of direct accusations such as those, because again, this is still a somewhat fluid and almost historical investigation at this point, looking back to review all those elements.
The family members say that they wanted deputies to confiscate the suspects, the mother's guns, because of that indirect threat. And earlier you had mentioned cases where you can and cannot confiscate people's weapons. Can you comment specifically on if he feared for his life inside of his own home because he knew his mother had threatened to kill him and had firearms? In that respect, is that an instance that the weapons could have been taken away from her?
Well, I'm not going to answer that relative directly to this case because I don't have enough working knowledge where if I speak to it, it's as though it should have occurred. I can speak in a general term when it comes to law. And if there are direct threats that rise above the threshold of a person being able to continue to possess those weapons because you believe they're going to be used in the commission of a crime, then you could justify the seizure of those. Now, when we talk about a civil seizure, if it's some other form, it requires a much higher threshold. And again, that's why I spoke earlier about, I've heard this discussion of, regarding having law enforcement professionals go out and make determinations relative to questioning things such as the mental state of an individual and possibly seizing firearms. I think that it is unfair and unreasonable to expect that law enforcement professionals become mental health professionals. So if it falls into that civil space, it's far more challenging, and I believe that it sets us up to a position to fail in both circumstances, because we're seizing weapons and violating or potentially violating the Second Amendment in some occasions, or when we fail to do so, we're judged for not doing so. And that's why I believe that the entire process and system right now requires considerable thought and review on how we're going to take steps to address this issue when people possess firearms that should not, that pose an immediate threat.
Can you speak to when you guys were responding to these 4 or 5 calls? Was it all in the past 4 to 6 months, or when were the calls?
Yeah, it was a relatively short time frame in the past 4 to 6 weeks, I believe.
Past 4 to 6 weeks.
Correct.
Was Anna Blessing given a mental evaluation after she was arrested and before she was put in jail? Was there any mental evaluation of her?
So you mean in the current state right
Yeah,
now?
after she was taken into custody?
We have Correctional Health Services, which is the side of the shop that handles everything from mental health to medical needs. And as I said, she's in the infirmary so that they can go through whatever due diligence they believe is appropriate. But those are issues that aren't things that I can speak to.
Sheriff, can you explain a little bit more of what
what happens in the infirmary? Is she locked up, or is she in an open, I'm just not familiar.
The infirmary is really just more a secured space that where we have medical and mental health staff more readily available to oversee and supervise that area, so that anybody that may have a direct need for care, it's available to them full time, as opposed to being detained in a cell or a pod where it's general population. So again, to my knowledge, it is not due to any injuries or mental health issues. It's more so because of her age, her advanced age. We want to make sure that she is cared for in good health.
Any signs of dementia?
I can't speak to those things. I don't know.
We understand they were living together, but who was the property owner, and would that be important to the investigation?
I don't know if the property owner issue only becomes relevant when it pertains to the search warrant, which is acquired in every circumstance of a homicide. But as it relates to the facts of this case, I don't know that it has a direct impact for any
You
reason.
mentioned there needed to be a threshold met in order for deputies and officers to seize weapons from somebody who another claims is a threat. Can you give us a hypothetical of when that threshold is met? When can deputies take away somebody's guns, firearms, weapons, when somebody else claims that he or she is being threatened?
It's a great question. My answer would be no. I don't like to get into hypotheticals because I don't want them to be drawn as parallels to the case at hand. My intent here today was to provide more detail, but to also reaffirm the commitment, which I've always held true to. We are going to do a thorough review of all aspects of this, and then we are going to come back to you and report when we have the factual basis relative to our actions, as well as the actions of the case and the investigation itself. I just want to make sure that you understood my commitment that process has already begun. But if I start speaking to those elements in advance, we draw comparisons that might not be fair, or we set a stage for expectations that are unrealistic. So I want to make sure that when we come to you with facts. And that's why, like I said, I started this off wanting to make sure I own my own words when I said they're not always preventable or predictable. And maybe in some cases we could have done more. I'm not saying that's the circumstance here, but I want to make sure that I do know that. And if we should have or could have, then we need to own it.
Is the responding deputy, is he on any kind of leave, or the one who showed up initially who took the report about the threats, is he being investigated? Is he on any kind of leave, or is this just an overall investigation into the case?
The investigation just began, and at the point, if we should determine there's a reason to place anyone on leave, we'll take that action immediately. But we want to have due process and due diligence, which means I'm not going to be presumptuous and put an employee under that burden prior to knowing that there is a justifiable action to do so. So as we speak, my deputy chiefs are reviewing all the body camera work as well as all the reports and all the information so that we can compile that information and make a determination of what is appropriate. But I do not want to reframe this in a manner that our employees feel as though they're being scrutinized in some way that is unfair. They're entitled to due process as much as anyone else. And if there was any shortcoming in any action that we carry out, what should have or could have been done to either educate, train, promote, or ensure there was accountability to everyone in this organization, we expect excellence, and we want to support our employees to reach those expectations. But ultimately, we're losing sight of, not we, so forgive me, I'm not trying to project that onto you, but this was a tragic loss. There's a family that lost a family member, a 92-year-old woman who's now incarcerated, taking the life of her son, alleged to have taken the life of her son, and I go back to it, as a society, we have to ask who we want to be. And when we see these types of actions, what are we willing and capable of doing to prevent them in the future?
Can you speak to what the protocol is when you guys are responding 4 or 5 times in just as many weeks to the same house for what appear to be similar calls? What's your guys' protocol? Like, does anything change on your end the more you're responding to a house for a similar domestic incident each time?
The baseline protocol is we evaluate each circumstance individually to determine if a crime has been committed, if a law has been broken. And that is our responsibility. As I said, we're asked to be counselors. We're asked to be, we deliver Narcan now in overdoses as though we're medical professionals, and it's a good thing that we can to save lives, but that's not our practice. So we're not drug recovery experts. We're not social counselors. So with each circumstance, our number one responsibility is to determine, has a law been broken, and what is our authority to act on that violation? And anything short of that, we try to find ways to resolve or solve problems. And when that call is concluded, it should be concluded in its own capacity before you respond to the next one and treat it as a new one. Now, you may have a compilation of events where it becomes necessary to seek outside services to intervene, We see this in civil disputes and other circumstances. So who else can be brought in to try to help in this manner? So that not we relieve ourselves of the responsibility, but we truly give it to those who are better suited to address it. So that could be any and all circumstances or calls where we see a volume of repeated concerns.
Can
In
you
this
comment
case,
as
do
to
you
whether the suspect resisted initially when she was taken into custody? Does she understand the charge against her and what she's alleged to have done?
Yes, according to the investigators, she was very aware, very competent. She did not resist. She was present when we entered there, and there was no conflict in taking her into custody.
Were deputies ever asked to remove her from the home before?
Not that I'm aware of.
I think she was going to ask, in this case, should you have called another agency to be involved, such as mental professionals or?
I don't know that yet, because as I stated earlier, we're in the review right now. I know that there was, to my knowledge, the one call that preceded this event was the one that maybe had the most substance relative to their conflict. But I can't speak to that because it would be premature for me to say at what point is the appropriate time to act on that. And as we know more, I assure you, you will know more.
So you are saying that there is the opportunity for deputies to come back and say, okay, we couldn't do anything here legally, but maybe we ought to refer this situation to another agency who can talk to these people and maybe work things out.
All city, state, and county governments try to build a sophisticated system that provides for all needs and services. And when appropriate, we try to call on our partners in those areas to, as I stated earlier, to solve problems, to resolve issues so that we're not talking about the loss of life like we are today. And my job is to make sure that when our deputies or employees act in a certain manner in the course of their duties, we hope that we train and prepare them to make the best decisions. And if we don't reach that, if we don't reach that level of excellence, then my job as a sheriff is to respond accordingly to ensure that going forward, we don't have any repeat of these things. Unfortunately, when you have a tragedy such as this, if there are lessons that could be learned, we can't undo what was done, and that's tragic.
The family tells me they feel this could have been prevented, that a deputy could have maybe acted or done something during the previous call to maybe have prevented the actual shooting. Is there a message you have for family members who express that concern?
I want to know if our agency could have done more in any way to have prevented this, but I also want to express, and I say this respectfully, and as journalists, I hope that you do your best to encapsulate the entire message here, which is compassion and sympathy for these circumstances, but also societal ownership. Prior to this event occurring, to maybe have intervened or provided services to intervene so that it would not have escalated to this place. We have to hold our deputies accountable, but not expect that the entire responsibility falls on them with every circumstance.
I did ask the family member, why didn't he, and she's 92 years old, why didn't he take her guns from her, the son? And she said he was trying to follow the law. Would he have been setting himself up for legal trouble had he taken her guns himself and taken it upon himself to get those guns away from her?
The only circumstance, and again, I don't want to get to a hypothetical, but we would have to weigh a threshold of would it be considered in some scenario of theft because she was the rightful owner of those weapons, and was he, how could he justify removing those, or versus, much like in the circumstance of it was law enforcement doing it, you're making a decision to take someone's Second Amendment right. It doesn't matter if you're family or others. Can you lawfully do that or not? And where does the law then come into play? So it's a scenario that does fall into the lane of a hypothetical. But I think that as individuals, we're accountable to our own actions, and we have to make those determinations or seek legal help beyond that. But law enforcement professionals can't be lawyers to give you all that advice or counsel. And if we do, then we've maybe exceeded our authority.
How unusual is it to have a suspect of this age in your jail?
I don't have any kind of information in front of me, but I would just tell you through experience that it's highly unusual.
What would you tell others at home that are probably considering placing seniors or placing people like these in senior homes and without their consent? You think it sends them a message in a way?
I don't think it's my place to send them a message when it relates to a decision regarding a family member that should or should not be placed into some type of a assisted living home. That's a very personal as well as a medical decision, and as a sheriff, that's not something that I should speak to. And I say that respectfully. I'm not trying to skirt your question, but it's a big decision for a lot of families that we encounter. So I'm happy to take one more, but I'm going to close, and I do appreciate your patience.
How many different deputies responded to the home? You said it was 4 or 5 different calls before the homicide. Was it the same deputies responding, or?
We have that answer, but I don't have it for you, so I'll make sure that one of our PIOs get that information for you.
So what are some of the challenges that you face in dealing with an inmate of that age?
No different than anyone else. If anyone comes in with a unique factors, we try to provide all the services necessary to ensure the health and well-being of anyone in our custody and do the best job we can working in partnership with correctional health. So I appreciate you guys. Thank you so much.
Have a good day.
Thanks, Sheriff.